So hello, good evening, everyone. It's really great to see you all again this evening. So many lovely faces. I love just looking at your faces, to be honest. All right, so we looked at that then, what was going on. Anyway, so after the First World War, then obviously, as you know, there was the Allies and the, what the other people call the Axis force, anyway. And then there was a conference of Versailles. And it's supposed to be a conference between America, French, British, Germans, and Austrians. But actually what happened, and that was the general expectation from the side of the Germans, was that they would be represented at the conference of Versailles and they'd all have a conference, a peace conference. But in reality, what happened, that German delegates were not allowed to participate. And they were just handed down the conclusions of the victors. Anyway, what happens when you win a war? Then you reorganize things. And so the victors in the First World War, they decided what they were going to do to all the people, to the empires and countries they defeated. And so they were all dismantled. And this is particularly under the inspiration of, you might say, Woodrow Wilson, who hated the idea of empire. He hated the British Empire as much as any other empire, and wanted to dismantle these empires within Europe. And so you had the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, German and Russian empires. The Russian Empire, which we'll look at, was dismantled differently. And then the victorious nations, they kept and expanded their empires. So some of the colonies at Tanganyika, for example, then was transferred to become part of the British Empire, or at least administered by Britain, and France and Japan also kept their colonies. And so many problems which exist in the world today are a result of the way in which these empires were dismantled, the way in which these lines were drawn to break them up into different bits. And so we look at the Ottoman Empire, obviously that we looked at yesterday, that included the whole of the Middle East. And so as a legacy of that, we have all kinds of problems. Kurdistan, which is a huge nation, but actually didn't end up being able to achieve statehood. At the Conference of Versailles, they weren't represented as far as I know. Then the problems there with Iraq. It's Kurdistan, then it straddles Iraq and Turkey, and I think bits of Iran as well. And also another consequence of breakup of the Ottoman Empire was the whole situation, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. We'll look at some of these things, Syria, Lebanon, and the way that these lines were drawn. Because a lot of these empires, anyway, it's just very complicated to look at. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, and you have the Balkans kind of problems that we've had there, Yugoslavia till today, problems in Eastern Europe, a lot of ethnic cleansing went on in the 20th century throughout Europe. And then, so the Russian Empire. So these all became republics within the Soviet Union. So Russia withdrew from the war in 1917 after the Bolshevik took power. They withdrew, led to the Russia actually shrinking a bit, the Russian Empire shrinking a bit. But then it was the Russian Empire then was broken up and into different republics within the Soviet Union. So we'll look at these, how this happened. First, the division of the Ottoman Empire. I'll look at this in more detail later, but this was the Ottoman Empire here. And then over during the 19th century, I mean, it was all the way across North Africa between the 19th century and the early 20th century. I'll look at the history of that. Changed. And then this part here, which was part of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the First World War, you ended up with Syria here, Lebanon, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, and Kuwait down here. That's how the Ottoman Empire is broken up. And then if we look here at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, again, it's broken up into these new countries. Czechoslovakia was created, Part of it went to Poland, new country called, anyway, just new countries that were created there. Again, we'll look at these things later. And then, as I said, the Russian Empire was broken up into parts, and each of them became a Soviet republic, Soviet Socialist Republic. So you had these new states or countries which had never existed before, because before they became part of the Russian Empire, they weren't countries like this. And so this is all part of the Russian Empire. Then it was broken up into these states, all the different stans down here in Central Asia, which was the sort of legacy of the Mongolian Empire, which was all over here. And then Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and the Latvian states here, which also used to be part of the Russian Empire as well. They were briefly independent after the First World War, but then became integrated into the USSR. So the USSR also then, that's how the Russian Empire was broken up. So we could, talked about how it was then that God's providence then is towards the breakup of empire. The whole biblical tradition is a critique of imperialism, a critique of one person or one nation ruling over other nations and trying to destroy their culture, trying to destroy it and eliminate their language and all these things. And that's basically the biblical approach to political philosophy, as we saw in the story of the Tower of Babel, but also in the prophetic critique against empire, which occurs over and over again throughout the Bible. And so also we looked at the divine principle, which also talked about every nation after the different wars becoming independent, and then the United Nations being formed, the Brotherhood of Nations. And so there in the principle also you don't get the vision that there should just be, okay, let's rephrase that. Anyway, at that particular part in the principle, there's a vision of peace between the nations and every nation being equal, having equal value and living in peace with each other. There are other passages in the divine principle which talk about the vision of world government and all this sort of stuff. I personally don't like that. 45 years ago, I thought that was great. Now I don't think that was a great vision at all. I think this is a much better vision of the one that's in the biblical tradition. And I don't get the impression that our movement is promoting world government anymore, to be honest. But certainly it was there in the early days of the principle. So what I wanted to look at then, start off with, is looking at, nowadays one of the biggest problems that people often talk about is the problem of Israel and Palestine. Of course, now there are all sorts of other problems going on as well. For a long time, it was a major problem. Still is a problem, but we'll look at the background. And so in order to look at the background, I don't have to go back as far as Adam and Eve, but again, we got to go back as far as Abraham. And when God called Abraham, God said to Abraham, made a covenant with Abraham, and God said, you should be the father of many nations. And then he said, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants forever. So it's an eternal covenant which can never be broken. It was 4,000 years ago. And what's so amazing is if you look at the promises that God made to Abraham, all those promises are being realized today, 4,000 years later. It's quite remarkable. It's probably written down about 3,000 years ago that they've all been realized. And part of this promise that God made to Abraham is, I'll give to you and to your descendants all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I'll be their God. And people think, okay, well, is this of any relevance? From the point of view of political philosophy, well, what's it got to do? How can God go around deciding that people own this piece of land or that piece of land? That's a sort of secular critique. We'll say, well, that's totally irrelevant. But actually, the theological perspective is, well, God is the creator of the universe. God owns the universe. God owns the world. God owns all the land. So God then is the only one who has the authority to allocate different pieces of land to different peoples. And so then God had the authority then to give this piece of land to Abraham and his descendants. But even though it says here it's an everlasting possession, Later on, it becomes qualified during the time of Moses, the Mosaic law. And God, through Moses, said, you can live in the land of Canaan, but you have to follow these laws. In this land, people have to observe the law, and they have to act justly. And if you don't observe the law, if you don't act justly, then the Bible says the land will spew you out. In other words, the land will throw you out. You can't stay there. So actually living in the land of Canaan then is conditional upon the way that the people behave who are living there. And so it's this kind of idea, that's the sort of legal basis for the descendants of Abraham to live there. And of course, all the people living in the land of Canaan today are all the descendants of Abraham. Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all the descendants of Abraham. And so, yeah, who are the descendants of Abraham? What is the land of Canaan? To whom should the land belong? And as I said, what authority does such a promise made 4,000 years ago have today? But for the people who are living there, they're all mostly very religious. And so for them, these kind of statements have incredible significance. Most people living with a secular philosophy, living in Europe or the Western world, they would say, well, you can't base ownership on a piece of land upon a promise that is allegedly made by God, assuming that God actually exists, so he probably doesn't, 4,000 years ago. What is that? So anyway, the people who are living there, these kind of things are very serious. So if you look at Abraham's family then, God promised he'd have a son. His wife was 77 years old, so Sarah suggested Abraham he should have a son through her maid Hagar. Now we call it surrogate motherhood. And then 13 years later, God spoke to Abraham and said, I'll bless Sarah, I'll give you a son by her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall come from her. So again, it's a remarkable promise and covenant made with Sarah. So that's why Jews, as I said yesterday, they don't talk about they don't talk about a father of faith, they talk about father and mother of faith. Yeah, Abraham and Sarah, they always bring them together as a couple. Because God didn't just bless and make a covenant with Abraham, he made it together with Sarah as well. And then Isaac was born. And then not long after that, Sarah supposedly saw Ishmael mistreating Isaac, and she became very concerned. And she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be the heir of my son Isaac. Abraham didn't want to do this because he loved Ishmael very much, his first son, and he argued with Sarah, and then he went and prayed and asked God about it. And God said to Abraham, immortal words, listen to your wife. Now I don't know why. You go to these sort of little souvenir shops. You find all these wise quotes on little bits of wood and little bits of stone and things. And I've yet to say one which says, God said to Abraham, listen to your wife. And it's there in Genesis 21. And it's a very good piece of advice. Anyway, so Abraham listened to his wife, and Hagar and Ishmael were sent out. But God said to Abraham, as consolation, I'll bless Ishmael and make him fruitful, and he shall be the father of 12 princes. And I'll make him a great nation. But I'll establish my covenant with Isaac. So God also blessed Ishmael. And when they went off into the desert and sent them away. And then we have this tradition later on, after Ishmael had gone, God told Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering on Mount Moriah. So the Bible says very clearly, your son, your only son, the one that you love, Isaac. And the Bible says Isaac. Muslims, though, believe it was Ishmael. In the Quran, it doesn't say Ishmael, it just says son. But the Muslims believe that it was Ishmael. And so this is the rock then upon which God told Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering, Mount Moriah. And Jacob also had a dream when he was going to Haran in the north. He traveled past here and apparently went to sleep here. And this is where he had the dream of the ladder going up into heaven. So it's a very holy and sacred rock. So according to tradition, on this rock, the Jewish temple was built. That's Solomon's temple. And the Muslims believe that on his night journey, Muhammad went to visit heaven from this rock. He went from Mecca on his night journey to the farthest temple, first temple, Jerusalem, and then went to from that rock to visit God and have a conversation with God in heaven. And now this rock is covered by the dome of the rock shrine. It's not a mosque, it's a shrine. Okay, so it means it's open to everybody, in theory. And traditionally it always was. And this is the old city of Jerusalem, which is this is the dome of the rock here. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then you have cities divided up into quarters. I don't know if they're exact quarters, a Christian quarter. And in the Christian quarter, there are many, many different Christian denominations which stretch back 2,000 years. Very obscure denominations which have been there for thousands of years that, most people have never heard of. And then there's a Muslim quarter here, and the Armenian quarter, where the cathedral, and the Jewish quarter connected to the Wailing Wall down there. And many, many shrines. So it's a very, very holy place for these three different faiths. Anyway, so after Sarah died, then according to the tradition, Abraham and Ishmael, Abraham went to find Ishmael, found Ishmael, and together they built the Kaaba, the first house for the worship of God. And it says in the Quran, as Abraham raised the foundations of the shrine together with Ishmael, they prayed, "Our Lord, accept this from us, you are the omniscient." So that then became the first house for the worship of God. The Jewish temple, of course, is built much, much later. So many, must be a long time, anyway, hundreds of thousands of years later, Muhammad then, when he was born, as a young man, he helped to rebuild the Kaaba, which, over the years, obviously fell into disrepair and needed to be repaired. And in 630, he cleared the Kaaba of all the idols. And it's an obligation for Muslims to go to a Hajj at least once, to go on a Hajj at least once in their lifetime if they can afford it. And good principle there, if they can afford it, not allowed to borrow money to go on the Hajj. Make sure you pay all your debts off before you can go. But these are the descendants of Abraham, to Ishmael, Arab nation, Arab people, Muhammad and Islam, and the religion of Islam, Isaac, Jewish people, and Jesus obviously was a Jew, and Christianity. And so very, very briefly, as we know, Jacob's family moved to Egypt. Moses took them out of Egypt into Canaan. And this is how the people settled in Canaan, the boundaries of the tribes of Israel, on the west and east bank of the River Jordan. And this was then, during the kings, it expanded. So we know about King David, I talked about before. King Solomon expanded the kingdom quite considerably, even though the actual boundaries of, this is one of the important points which I mentioned before, that when God told Moses, you can go take the people to live in the land of Canaan, then God specified very clearly the boundaries of the land of Canaan. There were borders. In other words, people of Israel were not supposed to expand beyond these borders. They were to be a nation state, not to become an empire and expand and conquer other peoples. Solomon, though, he expanded the kingdom, and he, so beyond these borders. Anyway, which is a mistake. But after he died, the kingdom split into north and south. And as we know, the Assyrian Empire destroyed the kingdom in the north. And then Jews experienced one empire after another, after the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians, and then the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire. And so here you have Herod, who's appointed the king of Israel by Rome. And after his death, it was divided. The kingdom was divided, and then Jesus lived at this time, born lived this time. You know, he was tried, put to death in Jerusalem. And so that's why there are many, many Christian holy sites, like Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is believed where Jesus was crucified and resurrection took place, and the tomb of Mary. And then Jewish people then, they wanted their independence. They didn't want to be part of any empire at all. They wanted to be independent. And so you had the first Jewish revolt against the Roman rule, which is about 30 years after, 40 years after Jesus died. He's crucified. And this has led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. This is the archer Titus, who was the person of the day, a Roman. You can see here taking all the treasures of the temple to Rome. The Romans used the money to rebuild Rome. So you look at the Colosseum in Rome, and you think, wow, that's an amazing building, a wonderful, extraordinary piece of technology and architecture. That was built with the money and the gold seized and stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. So look at all these beautiful buildings in Rome. They were financed by the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That's where the money came from. And that's the way an empire functions. You go along, you invade somebody, you take all their gold, you take their silver, and you go along, you spend it back home. And that's why some of these great imperial cities are the way they are, because that was the way it was. The second Jewish revolt, 500,000 Jews are killed, nearly 1,000 villages destroyed. All the Jews who weren't killed were sold into slavery, and Jews were forbidden to live in Jerusalem, and the Romans renamed Israel Palestina. And so you had the diaspora. There were already Jews living all throughout the Roman Empire and all throughout the Middle East. But then this main center of Judaism, the people were either killed or sold into slavery. So all that remained were the Jews that were already settled outside Israel. And then the Romans became Christian. Emperor Constantine, he supported Christianity. His mother was a Christian, brought him up that way, and he was just baptized just before he died. And then his mother, Empress Helena, she started building, was that the wife or his mother? I think it was his mother. Anyway, she started building many churches. So she went to the Holy Land, she found the true cross, and found the site where Jesus was crucified and the resurrection took place. And you can imagine there would have been Christians who'd been living there who'd remembered all these things. You know, the disciples of Jesus, they would have been living in, and descendants of the disciples of Jesus would carry on living in Jerusalem, and they would have remembered where these particular sites were. They would have given names to them. So it's not that she went around doing an archaeological dig and discovery. She went there, she talked to the local Christian community. They said, well, this is actually the site where Jesus was crucified, this is where the resurrection took place, etc. And so here you have the Basilica in Bethlehem, the site where Jesus believed to be born. And then many pilgrimages to the Holy Land and Jerusalem developed. And then in the 6th century, you had the rise of Islam. So Israel at that time, that land of Israel, then became part of the Byzantine Empire and was settled by Christians. The Jews weren't allowed to live there. Although there were Jews continuing to live in Israel, the land of Israel, the Holy Land, all the time, but they were expelled from Jerusalem, weren't allowed to go live in Jerusalem. The whole city was leveled and the whole city plan was completely changed. So Muhammad then, he was a seal of the prophets, that means he's the last prophet. And Islam sees itself as heir to the promises given to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. So Muslims think that the Quran, all the prophets were given a book, received a book, and that these books have become corrupted. So they would say the Torah, which was given to Moses, it became corrupted and re-edited, and the Gospel given to Jesus, this was also corrupted and re-edited. Whereas they claim that the book given to Muhammad, the Quran, was not corrupted and not re-edited, so it's the most authentic, authoritative one. Curiously enough, in the Bible, they will also say the same about the Psalms, which are given to the prophet David. They're also not corrupted. Anyway, so it sees itself as the heir, the promises given to Abraham, inhabit the land of Canaan, and to Moses and to Jesus. They would say the Jewish people failed because they didn't accept Jesus, and they persecuted the prophets. Christianity failed for various reasons, and so Islam then is the inheritor of this tradition. Therefore, Muslims then, Islam doesn't start with Muhammad. Islam started with Adam. Adam was the first prophet. And so they accept and recognize the legitimacy and authority of all the prophets from the time of Adam up until Muhammad. And they say all these prophets were Muslims because they all submitted to God. They're all Muslims. And so then initiated jihad to establish Muslim hegemony to facilitate the spread of Islam. So Islam itself wasn't spread by the sword. People weren't forced to convert to Islam, but by expanding Muslim hegemony or empire, then it facilitated the spread of Islam by Muslim missionaries, a lot of whom were. Okay, so after Muhammad died, there was a big disagreement about who should inherit his authority and leadership. How do you decide this? So the next day, they had to decide who's going to be the leader. And so one way of doing it is to say, okay, we should decide the leader should be the one who's the most capable. And so this was recommended by the people of Medina, particularly, should be Abu Bakr. Whereas the Muslims who came from Medina, which is where Muhammad, of course, from Mecca, which of course is where Muhammad himself came from, they said it actually should be a spiritual authority, which means the leader should come from within his family. And so they recommend it should be Ali, who's the husband of Fatima, who was one of Muhammad's daughters. So there's a big conflict there. In reality, it was decided then that it should go along with the social political, and so Abu Bakr then became the first caliph after the death of Muhammad. And so this led to a split. Day after the death of Muhammad, there was a split within the Muslim community. And so the Shia, who's predominantly in Iran today, but also a lot in Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, they believe the ruler of Islam should be from the family of the Prophet. And so they're mostly in Persia, Iran, and Iraq. So that was their belief. And so then the Sunni, on the other hand, they believe that the ruler could be any qualified person. And so it's predominantly people who are Arabs. Also Turkey and most Muslim countries are Sunni. So there's a big, huge difference there. And so in the world, so there are some differences in practice and belief, like the way they pray and things like this, and dress, but predominantly it's a difference about who should be the leader, who should have the spiritual and political authority. And so this manifests in the world today by two rival models. In Iran, you have the Shia model, where you have leadership by the spiritual leader, the Ayatollahs, and who have the ultimate authority. And there's this expectation that the hidden imam will come back. And then in something like Turkey, you have very much a secular kind of model, which was the one which was in the Ottoman Empire as well. Not about spiritual leadership, but something separate. Division there between, well, it's not secular and spiritual leadership, but anyway, division there between political and religious leadership, you might say. Okay, so after the death of Muhammad, then, I said Muslim armies, Muhammad was able to unite all the different tribes in Arabia. And then the Caliph Umar, who I think was the second or third caliph, he conquered Palestine and Jerusalem from the Byzantines in 638. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was built a few decades later, and then the Dome of the Rock was built, which I showed you before. And Jews and Christian pilgrims were allowed to freely visit the holy sites, because Muhammad said, as Islam expanded, people had a choice. If people were people of the book, in other words, Jews or Christians who had a book from their prophet, then they didn't need to convert to Islam, because Muslims recognized the authenticity and authority and legitimacy of Judaism and Christianity, and also any other religious tradition which had a book, a revelation. The idea that God sent a prophet to every people with a revelation, with a book. People who didn't have a religion, didn't have a book, basically pagan, they were given a choice: either convert to Islam or you get put to the sword. Anyway, so Jews and Christians then, their religion was recognized as being authentic, and they were allowed to freely visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. As I said, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, at one end of the Temple Mount. Towards the other end is the Dome of the Rock. And Islam spread incredibly rapidly. This is during the time of Muhammad, then during the time of the first caliphs, and then throughout North Africa and into Spain. And all these lands here, you might wonder, well, what religion do these people have? Basically, all of North Africa is the land of St. Augustine. All the people living in North Africa and Spain, they were all Christians. Various kinds of Christians. In Spain, predominantly Arians, but they were Christians. Here, they're all Orthodox Christians. And Christianity certainly spread a long way throughout, at least as far as here. So why did all these people then adopt Islam? Because the Christians who are living in these lands here, they didn't see Islam as being a new religion or a different religion, because Muhammad recognized Jesus was the Messiah, recognized the virgin birth. There's more written about Mother Mary in the Quran than there is in the New Testament. Muslims believe that Jesus will return at the last days. There'll be a final judgment time. And so Islam then appeared to be like a reforming movement. So Christians living in these lands, which later became Muslim, they saw Muhammad as a prophet, and Islam then as a reforming movement within Christianity. And so that's why its acceptance spread so rapidly. Right, strict monotheism. Then Arabs then became Sunni, capital was Damascus, incredible city, and a huge expanse of the Islamic land, continued in Spain until the 11th century. So if you look at this is what was going on in Spain, the Caliphate of Cordoba, this was, which lasted till then. And then after that, some other people came who were much less tolerant from North Africa and established different rule. But in the Caliphate of Cordoba, it was a golden age of culture, science, art, architecture, philosophy, incredible libraries, medicine, astronomy, because it was a golden age of Europe. Now you go anywhere else in Europe at this time, there's nothing to compare with the architecture, the culture, the science, or medicine, or anything. It was extraordinary. So this here is, what's it called in Granada? I think it was the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Extraordinary building. Anyway, when Castile expanded and all Muslims were driven out of Spain, then they decided, what are we going to do with these extraordinary mosques and buildings? So in this particular one here, they decided, okay, we need to convert it into a church. We're not going to knock it down. So they just built a church in the middle of it. Doesn't really look very nice, does it? But that was always the way things were. So the greatest, And then, so in Spain then, Muslims were relatively tolerant of Jews and Christians. So it's also not just the incredible flowering of Muslim culture and learning. There's also a flowering of Christian and Jewish learning and culture. That's where Maimonides came from Spain at that time. And so you might wonder, well, how did it become like that? Okay, so yeah, so Jews and Christians, and they were tolerated, but they had a status called dimitude. So in this status, they had to acknowledge Islamic superiority, in other words, and accept Islamic power. They had to acknowledge Islam as superior to Judaism and Christianity. They had to accept Islamic power, and it has to be an Islamic government and Sharia law. And then they had to pay a tax called a jizya to the Muslim rulers. So they weren't allowed to fight in the army, because only Muslims were allowed to fight in the army. But instead of fighting the army, they had to pay a tax instead. They weren't allowed to commit blasphemy, of course. And also they weren't allowed to engage in witnessing activities. There were restrictions which were placed upon the way which they were able to practice. They weren't allowed to convert Muslims to Judaism or Christianity. They had to follow the rules. And these are things like restrictions on their clothing, wearing a special badge, No new synagogues or churches could be built, because they weren't allowed to expand. A dhimmi man, the Jew or Christian man, allowed to marry a Muslim woman, but the reverse was acceptable. So Muslim men are allowed to marry Jewish women, and Christian women. Also, dhimmi was not allowed to give evidence in an Islamic court. And you might think, well, okay, living in the 21st century, you might think, well, that's not very fair, is it? That's not just. What about equality? I'm telling you, this was far more advanced than anything else in Europe at that time, in terms of respecting the rights of minority religions and minority people. Far more advanced. So, for example, Jews and Christians were not forced to live in ghettos. So this time, Jews living in Christian Europe, they were forced to live in ghettos. Under Muslim rule, they were not. That's why Muslims, generally speaking, wanted to prefer to live in Muslim countries. Jews prefer to live in Muslim countries than in Christian countries. And they were not slaves. In European countries, well, I guess most European countries, certainly in England, Jews who lived in England were the private property of the King of England. He owned them. They were like his slaves. He actually legally owned them. They were his property. And so when a Jewish man died, a wealthy financier died, then all his money was inherited by the King of England. That wasn't the case in Muslim countries. If a Jew died in a Muslim country, he could pass on his money and his inheritance to his children. Jews and Christians weren't prevented from following their faith, whereas in Christian Europe, there was a huge amount of persecution of Jews, and in many ways they weren't allowed to follow their faith freely. Never mind the fact that Catholics persecuted Protestants and Protestants persecuted Catholics. They were not forced to convert or die. You might wonder, well, how did Christianity expand in Europe? Well, that person, King Charlemagne, he wanted to expand his empire into the Saxon lands, and the Saxons were pagans. They worshipped in forests, trees, were very central to their faith. They had their own gods, like the Viking gods and Teutonic gods. And so Charlemagne forced the Saxons at the point of the sword to convert to Christianity or to be put to death. And many Saxons refused to convert, and thousands of them were slaughtered. Thousands of Saxons were slaughtered by Charlemagne because they refused to convert to Christianity. They refused to accept Charlemagne as their ruler. They refused to accept his laws because they wanted to adopt and follow Saxon laws. They were not banned from any particular ways of earning a living. They often took on jobs shunned by Muslims. Again, Jews living in Christian Europe were banned from earning a living in many different ways. They were restricted basically to financing. Anyway, so Christians and Jews living in Muslim countries often did unpleasant work such as tanning and butchery, but also many pleasant jobs such as banking, dealing in gold and silver. And many Christians and especially many Jews in Muslim countries, they were very high up in the administration and the government of Muslim countries because they're very well educated. You wouldn't be regarded as a Jewish adult unless you could read and write. And so they were very, very literate, and so often had very high and prestigious positions within Muslim government. And the position of women also was far superior in Muslim countries for Muslims. Muslim women were allowed to own their own property. Muslim women were allowed to go out to work, and if they earned money, they kept that money for themselves. They didn't have to contribute to the family. The husband was supposed to work to support his wife and his children. But if a woman went out to work, she could keep the money. But she could own property. That's in the Quran. Now, a married woman living in England wasn't allowed to own property until the 1880s. That was not very long ago. So the actual position of women in Muslim countries is far better in theory. In practice, of course, it's often not like that. But in theory, in terms of Sharia law, it's far, far superior than it ever was in Christian Europe until recently. The whole feminist movement, all that kind of. Anyway, so what happened a bit later on? Well, new dynasties come along. Fatimid dynasty established in Egypt. The caliph there a bit of a fanatic, to be honest, destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009. Obviously, this caused a lot of outrage in the Christian world. The Seljuk Turks were moving in from Central Asia. They defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert and seized Anatolia, which is now a large part of Turkey. And the Christian pilgrim routes were threatened. So Christians in Europe became very concerned. Pope called for a crusade. He was invited by the Patriarch in Constantinople to retake Jerusalem and protect the pilgrims. And so Pope Urban preached a crusade. 9 crusades. Jerusalem's captured, population was massacred, Jews, Christians, Muslims, they are all put to death, all put to death. The streets in Jerusalem were flowing with blood, completely indiscriminately, massacred everybody. And then Crusader rule was established for a couple of hundred years, not very long to be honest, about 300 years at the most, during these places here. It didn't make a huge impact upon the Muslim world until recently. People talk about the Crusaders, but at the time it didn't make a huge impact. When you look at the geography, the Muslim world was vast. This is just a little slither here in the Eastern Mediterranean. But then after Muslims pushed back, and then the Knights, Christian Knights, they left there, they occupied Cyprus, and their main base then after that became Malta. We've still got these huge Crusader forts along the coast there, guarding the pilgrim routes. And so the Seljuk Turks had moved in here. And then Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans. That's the Turks who moved in. Eventually they conquered Constantinople. That's the greatest and largest church in Christendom at that time, the Hagia Sophia. It then became a Muslim mosque, really concentrated as a mosque. And so this then is the Ottoman Empire that expanded. Anatolia, this area here. So these are the Turks coming from here, from Central Asia. Turkic people settled here and then started expanding further across the Bosphorus and took over a huge part of Europe, Eastern Europe, all the way almost as far as the gates of Vienna, and also North Africa as well. By this time, Spain had already become Christian. In the late 15th century, the Muslims were driven out of Spain. Jews were also driven out of Spain as well. Most of the Jews who were driven out of Spain, they took refuge in Muslim countries where they're welcome. So you can see this is the Ottoman Empire at its height, the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. In many ways, technologically, culturally, it's far, far more advanced than Europe was at this time. And Europe then was starting to catch up and starting to change. And if we look, okay, so Muslim contribution. So you might wonder, well, where did Muslim get all this knowledge from to be able to create such a vast civilization and empire? Well, they're very wise. They said, with search for knowledge, wherever it comes from. Muhammad said, search for knowledge, doesn't matter where it comes from. And so when they invaded and they defeated the Romans, they found, wow, these amazing buildings. How did they manage to build these amazing buildings? So at that time, the Roman Empire was incredibly weak. That was because of there'd been a plague. It's about a tenth of the population in Byzantium had died. Lots of literally empty towns and villages. So it's quite easy for the Muslim armies and Arab armies to expand because the plague didn't touch Arabia itself because it's the desert. Anyway, so when they came here and they saw all these things, they thought, wow, this is amazing. And so they set up a place in Baghdad to translate all the books from Greek into Arabic. And the main people who were doing that translation were Jews who were able to, and Christians who were able to translate from one language to the other. There were Arab Jews and Arab Christians as well. And so they inherited and built upon this knowledge from Greece. And also when they got as far as India, they inherited a lot from there and developed science and chemistry. Well, that comes from an Arabic word, alchemy, So a lot of the stuff that happened in the Enlightenment in Europe was knowledge that was translated in Spain from Arabic into Latin. And then that's how this knowledge entered into Europe. And so lots of the sciences were developed in the Arab world, and that's why we still have the names have been inherited into the English language. They developed physics, lenses, biology, incredible horticulture, agriculture, and botany, mathematics, algebra. The word is an Arabic word. The numbers, we talk about the Arab, these are Arabic numerals. The zero itself they got from India, but these are the Arabic numerals. And if you look here, you just turn this Arabic numeral on its side, you get a 2. Turn this one here on its side, you get a 3, etc., etc. So it's similar. Anyway, these Arabic letters also, as I explained before, when I was talking about Judaism, actually came from the Hebrew, even before that. And then they developed medicine, was incredibly developed in Central Asia, particularly surgery there. They used to do transplants and all kinds of things in the Middle Ages. Standard textbooks we get in Europe today, they're based upon the Arab text, the Muslim textbooks. Developed historiography a long time before this developed in Christian Europe. Geography, some of the oldest, the most detailed maps and atlases from that time are from this time. Commerce, trade, down the Silk Route between China, incredibly well developed. Libraries, the biggest libraries, the first universities, art, architecture, all kinds of inventions like telescope, the pendulum, the watch, and incredibly beautiful calligraphy, and beautiful tiles, and all kinds of beautiful art. So that was incredibly highly developed. Okay, but when we look at the Muslim world today, you can see it's not as advanced in all those aspects compared to Europe and the Western world. So what changed? Well, there's a relative decline in the Muslim world, in the Ottoman Empire, came from the modernization which started to take place in Europe. And well, how did that start to take place? Well, Europe during the Middle Ages was pretty beautiful cathedrals, but people lived in a lot of poverty. People were peasants. There were famines. During the 14th century, I think about a third of the population in Europe died through famine. The Black Death, all these things, Europe was incredibly poor and underdeveloped at this time because the medicine, the art, the architecture, the buildings after the fall of the Roman Empire, I think it took about 600 or 700 years before another stone bridge was built. So a lot of the knowledge from the Romans and the Greeks before that was lost within medieval Europe. And a lot of it came back into medieval Europe through the translations from the Arabic into the Latin, which were done predominantly in Spain. And then also with the fall of Constantinople, a lot of Greek texts came into Europe. And so here you have then the sparking the beginnings of the Renaissance. And the beginning of the Renaissance then, Europe starts to learn from the Muslim world. Of course, when the Crusaders went to fight, they were overwhelmed and in awe of how incredibly advanced Muslim culture and civilization was. And so they also brought ideas back to Europe. Anyway, so this modernization in Europe then started with the Renaissance, and where there was freedom to be creative within Florence, which is the city where it started. People could paint how they wanted to paint. And there weren't restrictions of what they could write and what they could paint. And so that's how, in order to be creative, you need to have the freedom to be creative. Up until that time, there was no freedom. But within some of these Italian city-states, the rulers decided we need, for whatever reason, wanted freedom. And so it attracted a lot of the artists and the scientists and people aspire to do these things. They felt actually in these city-states like France, we can express ourselves, we can create what we want to create. We don't have to worry about this, that, and the other. And so it started there. Okay, so I was talking there about the Ottoman Empire, and as I said, for 1,000 years, it was way ahead of anything going on in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe. But then when we look at the world today, we can see that the Western world has far overtaken the Muslim world. So how did that happen? Because that has huge implications for the whole relationship between the Muslim world and the Western world today. So I had this beginning of modernization in Europe, particularly in the Italian city-states, where they were relatively good government and freedom and law. And that's why if you go to somewhere like Tuscany, you can see the incredible wealth that was there at that time. Incredibly wealthy. I was there some years ago and I thought there's nothing in England to compare to the buildings and the wealth and the art and the architecture that was in these Greek cities, in these Italian city-states at that time, far ahead of what was going on in Britain. But anyway, with the Reformation then came big arguments, and in Europe up until up until relatively recently, if you wanted to live a peaceful life, you had to subscribe, and were a Christian, you had to subscribe to the Nicene Creed. If you didn't accept the Nicene Creed, you were regarded as being a heretic. You could be persecuted, you could lose your job, and in extreme circumstances, you could even lose your life. So that puts a bit of a damper upon free thinking, upon questioning what you've been told. Oh, don't question. I remember my mother, who was, said, I think before she was born in Jerusalem, my mother's mother's Jewish. And so my mother's always asking questions. Anyway, during the war, Second World War, her parents sent her to England to go to school, to boarding school, to a convent, Catholic convent. And my mother kept asking these awkward questions. And the nun said, don't ask questions, just believe, it's a mystery. And she got into trouble because she kept asking questions, because that's where she came from, a questioning kind of person, always wanted to understand things. And anyway, so that becomes a problem. But with the Reformation then, you had this, instead of the Pope and the church having authority to tell people what they had to believe, the Word of God, the Bible, then became the source of authority for what people believed. But of course, when you start reading the Bible, you can interpret the Bible in all sorts of different ways. And that's what happened within Britain especially. You had lots of people starting to read the Bible and would interpret the Bible in all sorts of different ways. And of course, they would argue about which is the correct interpretation of the Bible. And some people thought it has to be interpreted like this. And other people said, no, this is the correct interpretation. Because they all thought there's only one correct interpretation, they started fragmenting. And so you had what we call it, the nonconformists in England. They were nonconformists. They wouldn't conform to what they were supposed to believe and to what they're supposed to do. And so with this nonconformism then, and after the Reformation, the Puritans, the Quakers, and all kinds of, a huge number of thousands actually of different weird little Christian sects appeared during the 17th century and became a sort of de facto religious freedom. That meant you could think whatever you wanted to think, you could say whatever you wanted to say, and you wouldn't be put in prison, you wouldn't be put to death. The Church of England would be upset with you, but they couldn't really do very much to you because there were too many of these nonconformists around. And they refused to go to the Church of England. They started making their own chapels and their own churches and places of worship, which were illegal, where there's so many of them that couldn't do anything about it. And so you ended up with that. And then, if you wanted to get an education, though, and go to university, you had to belong to the Church of England. But a lot of these nonconformists, they didn't belong to the Church of England, obviously. There were Methodists and Baptists and all kinds of funny little groups, Quakers and others. And so they started their own educational institutions, technical ones predominantly. And these are the people then, they started sitting around in cafes, they came up with all sorts of ideas and inventions. And that then became the beginning of the agricultural industrial revolution, which took place in England. We had the freedom to experiment, the freedom to do things differently. The church could no longer control them. They didn't need permission to invent something, didn't need permission to build a factory, didn't need permission to develop something, didn't need permission to set up a shop, they didn't need anybody's permission to do anything. It was freedom under the rule of law. This made the possibility of innovation and economic development, which is why Britain, the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain, because first of all, freedom of religion, then the rule of law, and then recognition of private property. The state couldn't take your property, the church couldn't take your property if they didn't like you because of the law. And then the possibility then this extraordinary economic development that took place, first of all, in Britain. And then along with economic development comes money. And so the government's happy when the economy is developing because taxes go up. When you got taxes, it means the government's got money to spend. And you can spend money on armies and military power. So military power depends upon a strong economy. And so there's other European countries, then they started to inherit the technology that was developed in Britain. And so other European countries also become economically stronger. And along with this strength came military power. And then they were able to start challenging the Ottoman Empire, which up until then had been militarily, economically, in every way, far more advanced. And so you start to have the expansion of European powers in Ottoman lands. So for example, Russia started moving south into Ottoman lands, such as the Crimea, took the Crimea from the Ottomans, Catherine the Great, and then started moving further into Central Asia, which also was Muslim. Then France became more economically powerful, more militarily powerful, then invaded North America. Sorry, not North America, I did that as well. North Africa, with Algeria, and those countries in Northern Africa that came under French rule, part of the French Empire. And Britain, of course, started expanding into Ottoman lands as well. Took a great interest in Egypt, for example. Cyprus became British, Malta as well, which wasn't Muslim anyway. Sorry, Malta was never Ottoman, but Cyprus is very much like that. So that was one aspect of the decline, relative decline of the Ottoman Empire, was the relative economic development and military development then in Europe. Also, there's a rise of nationalism, along with one of the byproducts of the Reformation was also the development of the idea of nationalism. So often being national churches instead of a universal Catholic church. Increasingly, people wanted to have national churches like the Church of England. And so you had the rise of nationalism, which is not connected to Protestantism in some parts of Europe, in the Balkans. They wanted to have their own nation. First one was Serbia, which is part of the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to have independence from the Ottomans. They fought for independence. Greece, which is part of the Ottoman Empire, also they had a war of independence. This was some famous English poet went there and died there. I can't remember his name now. And the Arabs they also wanted to become independent. And so the rise of Arab nationalism, because the Ottomans were Turks, and that's different to Arab. And so the Ottoman Empire then got the name in the sort of 18th, particularly 19th century, the sick man of Europe. It was regarded as a European power, but it was a sick man of Europe at that time. And so this then led to a huge impact upon the Muslim world, the relative economic, technological, cultural development of Europe compared to the Muslim world. Because for 1,000 years, Islam had been, the Muslim self-understanding is that Jews and Christians should accept Islam as superior and should accept Islamic government. And for a long time, the Muslim world was superior in every aspect. But now with the rise of Western Europe, it became a huge shock for the Muslim world, culturally, in all kinds of different ways, the rise of modernity. And that's one of the things that the Muslim world is still struggling to deal with till today, modernity, and to what extent does Westernization go along with modernity? Yes, we want to have Western technology, but we don't want to have Western values. Okay, so that feeds into that aspect of what's going on in the Middle East. And then if you look at recent Jewish history, as I said, it was compared to for Jews living in the Christian world, it was very, very difficult compared to living in the Muslim world. Often there were forced conversions and baptism. Sometimes, a Jewish couple would have a baby. Some fanatical Christian would come along, baptize the baby and say, this is no longer a Jewish baby, this baby is now Christian, and therefore has to be brought up and adopted by a Christian family. Compulsory Christian sermons in synagogues, totally good for interfaith relations. Public disputes, which Jews were always very careful to just lose, because they knew if they won, then there'd be a pogrom or something, so they would just lose to maintain their dignity, and they all knew that they could have won if they wanted to. Jewish books were burnt, and the Torah scrolls forced into ghettos, or they could only live in this particular area. Restrictions on the professions, they weren't allowed to enter most professions. The only profession they were allowed to enter was financing, because the Catholic Church, from the Catholic point of view, usury, lending money for interest, is against Catholic law. The Catholics then weren't allowed to lend money for interest. So the Catholic Church said, well, the Jews, they can lend money for interest. So they're forced them basically into the finances and into banking. There are lots of expulsions, slaughter, genocide, and sorts of things. These are just a list of some of the areas of expulsion. First, it started here. We were expelled from here to here, all over the place. In England as well, one of the earliest ones. Also expelled from Spain. And a lot of them moved up to Poland. You might wonder why. When the Crusades moved through Europe to go here, on the way there were lots of Jews living. So they started killing Jews. So a lot of Jews up sticks when they moved to Poland. They weren't allowed to live in Russia. Went up to Lithuania, which is where some of my ancestors come from. So if we look at the land of Israel itself, coming up to a bit more up to date, the Jews have always lived in the land of Israel, even though they weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem, but still there were always Jews living in the land of Israel. And return to Jerusalem, Israel is a constant theme within Judaism. Every time they celebrate Passover, next year in Jerusalem, for 2,000 years, there's this hope and expectation that we want to return to Jerusalem, we want to return to Israel. The land of Israel is intrinsically part of the Jewish faith, in a way that Christianity is not connected to any particular land, whereas for Judaism, it's connected to this particular piece of land that was given to the descendants of Abraham. The return to Jerusalem then is something which is very, very, very much alive all the time. And Jews often emigrated there during the Middle Ages. When they're kicked out of Spain, Maimonides, he went through North Africa and he settled in the Holy Land, the land of Israel. There are lots, in Safed, for example, was always a big Jewish mystical community there. And then later on, Jewish philanthropists, they sponsored agricultural settlements in the 19th century. And so this one here is called Mikveh Israel. It's an agricultural school started in Palestine, as it was called then, in 1870. That's my great-grandfather was one of the very first students and gave it its name. This is Petah Tikva, which is the first new town founded in Israel, or the first new town founded in the Holy Land for 2,000 years. So my great-grandfather is one of the pioneer founders of that. And then we have the growth of Zionism. And so Zionism then, it's a movement to support the Jewish homeland of the biblical land of Israel. And you might wonder, why did Zionism develop? Well, Zionism developed in Europe as a response to the rampant anti-Semitism of the 19th century Europe. The most anti-Semitic country in Europe was Russia, till today. And so there are lots of Russian pogroms and expulsions. You might wonder, well, Jews actually weren't allowed to live in Russia. So how did they get to be in Russia? Well, if you remember one of the maps, Russia actually occupied Poland at one point. And then the Russians said Poland doesn't exist as a country or as a people. They're all Slavs, like we are. Just like Putin said, Ukraine doesn't exist as a nation or as a people. They're all Slavs. They're all really Russians. They just don't know it. And that was what was going on there in Poland as well. So that meant Poland became part of Russia. Well, that meant that the millions of Jews living in Poland now found themselves living in Russia. And suddenly they started to want to make use of Russian universities and everything. And the Russians started passing all kinds of laws limiting what Jews were allowed to do within Russia. Because where they were allowed to live, whether they were allowed to do this work or that work or go to university or whatever. And so then the Russians, a lot of pogroms and expulsions during the 1880s, a lot of them were expelled from Russia and they started moving into Europe. And they were economically in a far worse state than Jews living in Europe. Jews living in Europe, Western Europe at this time, were relatively prosperous. Because one of the good things Napoleon did is he brought this idea of rights and emancipation of the Jews in Germany and other countries. And so Jews then were able to go to university, they're able to enter the professions. This is one of the good legacies of Napoleon, was coming out of the idea of the rights of man. Anyway, so Jews then started moving into Europe. Jews living in Europe weren't very happy because they're all very, kind of coming out of these very, very poverty-stricken shuttles in Russia. And it led to the rise of anti-Semitism, all these people Jews coming from Russia. And that's also why a lot of Jews, anyway, there were Jews who believed in God, but there were also Jews who were atheists. They were Jews, but they were atheists. They had a Jewish way of thinking, but they were atheists. And when they looked at what was going on in Russia, they felt that's really unfair. The way we're being treated is unjust. It shouldn't be like this. And so that's why a lot of Jews, secular atheistic Jews, they became Marxists, they became communists, and quite a few were involved in the Russian Revolution, not as religious Jews, but as atheistic Jews like Trotsky, who were really angry and upset about the incredible injustice that was going on. Then it wasn't just in Russia. In France, there's what infamous Dreyfus affair. Jews, generally speaking, when they're living in a particular country, they're very loyal citizens because they realize if we're not loyal, we're going to get into trouble. So one of the most important verses in one of the prophets, I think it's Jeremiah, when they go to settle in Babylon, Jeremiah said, pray for the peace of the city which you're living in. So for Jews then, they always pray for the land in which they're living, they pray for the government, they pray for the people. In England, for example, Jews sing the national anthem, they, in a synagogue, much to the shock of many British people who can't even remember what the words are. And so anyway, so Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus was a French army officer who was a Jew, and he was very highly respected and got advanced very high to a very high level. But anyway, there was a spy, and someone had obviously, released some official secrets. And anyway, the regular French officers, they decided to say it was Dreyfus who did this. And so he was tried, he was found to be guilty, he was sent off to a penal colony, and then his famous French author who wrote The Miserables, what was his name now? Anyway, sorry, my brain is dead. Thank you. So he got very upset about this, he investigated this is incredibly unjust, and so there's a movement. And so eventually, they retried Dreyfus and found him guilty again, but eventually it's found out that actually another French officer had been the one who betrayed and sold the secrets. And so eventually Dreyfus was released. For the Jewish community in France, it was really difficult. They thought they weren't happy with this campaign to get Dreyfus released, because all it did was it led to the rise of a huge amount of anti-Semitism in France. They said it's better for Dreyfus to stay in prison and die there, at least keep his head down. Anyway, Dreyfus was released, and the people who opposed Dreyfus, they became the politicians behind the Vichy government when the Nazis took over that particular part. A lot of anti-Semitism in France. There's a lot of persecution then, obviously, in the 1930s, and of course the Holocaust in the 1940s. So there was a person, I can't remember his name now, the founder of the first Zionist conference. He went to the trial of Dreyfus, and he was so deeply shocked by the outpouring of anti-Semitism over the Dreyfus affair. It's like, for the French establishment, the Catholic establishment or atheist establishment, is deeply humiliating what happened, that Dreyfus was found to be innocent. And so it led to the right, and nobody likes to be humiliated. And so it led to a huge rise in anti-Semitism. And so this person, I can't remember his name now, you could see this is the way it's going to go. And no idea there's so much latent anti-Semitism which just comes out over and over again. And so that's why I said, well, this isn't safe. This could be a disaster. And so he decided to start the first Zionist Congress just after that. And so Zionism then was a secular movement, but it had religious roots. There's expectation, the hope for Jews to go back to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. But the Zionists themselves, a lot of them were atheists. It's basically they were socialists. But what they wanted was a desire for a refuge from persecution. Because of the rise of nationalism in Europe, every nation wanted to have its own state. But even though there were Jews scattered throughout Europe, they didn't have their own country. They didn't have their own state. They didn't have their own place where they could go for refuge from persecution. And also this desire, once again, to become a self-governing independent nation, like all the other nations. Well, not all the other nations, but like many other nations. And so there's a rise of nationalism all over Europe at this time. People wanting independence, the Serbs and other people, the Balkans. And so, a lot of secular Jewish people wanted the same. Zionism was opposed by religious Jews. Anyway, they had this first Zionist Congress in 1897. And then you had the First World War and between these different countries. And then as part of the war, then of course you're strategizing. Okay, if we win the war, what are we going to do to the countries that we defeated? What should we do with the empires we defeated? So the British and French, who have always been rivals, they signed a secret agreement on post-World War spheres of influence. They say, okay, let's divide the Ottoman Empire up like this. This will be French, I think it is. This is French influence. This will be British down here, what's modern day Iraq, and this will be British influence. They sort of drew it up like that, this agreement they made. Didn't actually work out like that, but that was part of the agreement, dividing up the Ottoman Empire. And then, okay, we've got to fight the Ottomans, who are Turks. And then the British realized, the Arabs are not happy living in the Ottoman Empire. Let's see if we can raise another front. Let's see if we can support Arab independence, and that'll weaken the Ottoman Empire. And so in 1916, Britain promised the Sharif of Mecca, who's the ruler of Mecca, that it would support Arab independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. And so one of the British officers who was leading this and negotiating and arranged this was someone called Lawrence of Arabia, and who was a British army officer. And so the agreement was, okay, we'll support Arab independence, except in these areas, the districts of Mersin and Alexandretta, and portions of Syria lying to the west, the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, cannot be said to be purely Arab, and that on that account they must be accepted from the proposed delimitation. So that was the agreement. Of course, this is in the middle of the war. Nobody knows who's going to win the war. It's just like, okay, if we win the war, then this. And of course, people make all kinds of promises and issue all kinds of letters of promises in the hope that if we win the war, this will be the outcome. And so that was what that was. And then, of course, then, that was a letter that was written. But then, of course, there's a big debate. Well, did this include Palestine? Did the area to be excluded from Arab control include what was under the Ottomans was called the Sanjuk of Jerusalem and the Vilayet of Beirut, in other words, Palestine? And the Arabs said no. And the British in 1922 said yes. They said this whole piece of this whole strip here then is not to be part of an Arab kingdom or whatever. So it's very complicated. And then at the same time, a lot of Jews living in Germany, naturally, they fought in the German army. And actually the Jews, in terms of by proportion, they won a greater number of Iron Crosses than Germans, relatively to the number of soldiers fighting in the German army. They fought very hard for Germany during the First World War. And so British think, okay, how can we persuade the Jews living in Germany maybe not to be so enthusiastic? And so there's a person called Weizmann who invented some explosives to help with the war, the British war. He was a professor at Manchester University, a Jewish professor there. Anyway, so he made an agreement then with the British government, and it's called the Balfour Declaration. Balfour was the foreign minister of Britain at that time. And Balfour wrote, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This is the letter called the Balfour Declaration, saying that the British government support the establishment of a national home for Jewish people. Again, this is a letter of intent. Nobody, of course, when the British government wrote that, they didn't know if they're going to win the war or not. They didn't know they could fulfill this promise or not. And this is interesting here, this little clause here, nothing shall be done which shall prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. You might wonder, well, who drafted that particular part of the letter? The person who drafted that particular part of the letter was a Jewish member of the British government. A Jewish member of the British government, originally Balfour said, okay, we'll have established a Jewish homeland, finished, full stop. But the Jewish member of the British government said, no, there's other people who are living there. We must not prejudice their civil and religious rights. And so they got these two different promises to the Arabs and to the Jews, which are mutually incompatible. That's the reality. But these are just promises made during the war, and you don't know how the chips are going to fall when the war finishes. And so sometimes people say on both sides, point at this letter and say, look, you betrayed us. The British, Jews say to the British, you betrayed us. And Arabs say to the British, you betrayed us. And it's true in terms of if you take these letters literally, but they're incompatible. And these are letters written during a time of war. And so after the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, then the Ottoman Empire is divided like this. And this here was assigned to be the Jewish homeland, this whole area here. And then Iraq then came under British rule. Kuwait was also influenced there. Egypt was under influence from Britain. Syria under French influence, and Lebanon under French influence and control. What's now called Turkey itself was then, there was an Italian part, and there's a Greek part here, and there's a French part here, and the British part over here. And that's the way that Anatolia was after the war. And then there's Kurdistan here, this huge area, which really goes over here too. And that's how it was for a few years. And during this time, I said, you got this part here, which a lot of Armenian people live in. They weren't happy living under the Ottoman Empire, hence they wanted independence. The Kurds also didn't like living in the Ottoman Empire because they weren't Turks, they were Kurds. Arabs didn't like living in the Ottoman Empire because they weren't Turks, they were Arabs, etc., etc. So during the war then, there was the Armenian genocide. About 1.5 million Armenians were murdered. Then after the war, there was a Treaty of Sevres, which was a partition of the empire along the lines that I showed you. Well, the Turks themselves weren't happy to have their country divided up. Part of the problem with this treaty was Kurdistan was not made an independent nation. I have to say that. It's a big mistake, which is lingering on until today. I think it's one of the biggest nations which isn't an independent state till today. And that's why you got all this stuff going on during the Iraq War. The Turks themselves, they didn't want to be divided, they didn't want to be ruled by these Europeans. And so you had a Turkish War of Independence for about 4 years, led by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. And he looked and he saw, well, okay, Turkey needs to modernize. Why we were defeated? Why was the Ottoman Empire defeated? Why we were defeated? It's because we were behind in terms of our economy, our civilization, our military, all these things. We were backwards. We need to modernize. We need to secularize. Instead of being a Muslim country, we need to become a secular country. And so that's why Turkey, until Erdogan, was basically a secular country and modernized things. So he abolished the Sultanate. He was a religious leader controlling the Ottoman Empire. And the Caliphate was abolished, which is the Sultanate was a political ruler. Caliphate was a religious ruler over the Ottomans, over indeed claimed to be the ruler for all Muslims. So this is a huge shock for the Muslim world, no more caliph. And that's why Al-Qaeda and people, they want to restore the caliphate. He declared that Turkey now is to be a republic and the capital was moved to Ankara. Okay, so that's what happened then. So that was, I said, it's a huge, huge shock for the Muslim world up until today, how to grapple, how to deal with this fact that the Ottomans, the Muslim world was defeated by the Western world. As I said, from a Muslim point of view, Jews failed, Christians failed, and Islam is the final, last prophet. It's a seal of the prophets. It's a far superior book of revelation, the Quran. The civilization, the culture, technology, economy, everything was far above what was going on in the rest of Europe, the Western world until that time. And now to find this kind of situation is something the Muslim world still is trying to grapple with and deal with till today.